It is my pleasure to welcome you to the LGBT Project's event, Let's Talk About Gender, Racialization and Liberation in LGBT Rights Work. My name is Celia Meredith. I am the current 3L Director of the LGBTQ+ project at the Maurer School of Law. As a pro bono student organization, the LGBTQ+ project provides pro bono legal research and advocacy services to Indiana LGBTQ+ advocacy organizations and LGBTQ+ Hoosiers. I am so excited to have you all join us today for a critical conversation between Kendra Albert and Avatara Smith-Carrington about the racialization of gender in relation to privacy rights, litigation strategy, and liberatory frameworks. Kendra is a clinical instructor at the Cyber Law Clinic, where they teach students to practice technology law. They also serve as the director for the Initiative for a Representative First Amendment, which provides funding and support to law students from backgrounds traditionally underrepresented in First Amendment law. Kendra holds a law degree from Harvard Law School, serves on the board of the ACLU of Massachusetts, and is a legal advisor for Hacking Hustling. They enjoy giving away other people's money, playing video games, and making people in power uncomfortable. Avatara is an attorney and the current Tyrone Garner Memorial Law Fellow at Lambda Legal. As the current Garner Memorial Law Fellow, Avatara's work centers on LGBTQ+, Black Indigenous people of color, and Black Indigenous people of color living with HIV. Avatara serves as a board member on the advisory board of the Kairos Fellowship and as a board member on the board of the Transgender Education Network of Texas. In their spare time, Avatara loves to discuss all things related to tech, race, and gender, read the work of Black women writers religiously, and occasionally likes to hit Dallas's trails on their bike. So with all that being said, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Kendra and Avatara, and please make sure to put questions into the Q&A box throughout their conversation. Thank you very much, Kendra and Avatara.
Thank you so much, Celia, and thanks so much to the LGBT project for having us. We're super excited to be here and sort of take a conversation that we've been having for a while to a new sort of audience and a new space. So I wanted to sort of maybe start a little by framing what I think we'll do today, and then I'll let Avatara chime in and make sure that they agree with my framing, which is first, I want to say that neither of us speak for our employers right now, right? We're talking sort of in our personal capacities as, trans folks who sort of have a perspective on LGBT movement work and LGBT impact lawyering in particular. And I think for me, I'm sort of thinking about this right now as this sort of moment of incredible violence, amongst many moments of incredible violence against trans siblings in states that have passed anti-healthcare laws, such as the one in Arkansas. And knowing that this is the same playbook that have been used against folks who have needed for abortion, against folks who have wanted or needed access to abortion for a while, we wanted to kind of like take a little bit of a step back and talk about the failure to how, like, thinking about gender as like a racialized construct and how that changes how we might approach LGBT movement lawyering, LGBT impact work, that kind of thing, and how this work is impacting folks' lives. So that's like my starting framing. If Avatara, anything you want to add or anything you want to flag before we sort of dive in?
Yeah, no, I really again, I'm so thankful to have this time to, bring a discussion that we've had and many different iterations to others, because I think that some of the best work that we can do is in community with a whole bunch of folks, and hearing people also engage with how we're thinking about these things as we move forward with like the work that has to be done. And then to kind of go off of what you were saying, Kendra, I think that we're at a critical juncture, and and I hate to say that because I feel like we're so often at that critical juncture, but I think especially right now we're at this point where we really have to determine whether we want to actually take a step back and like be, thoughtful critics of how specifically, LGBT quote unquote movement spaces have been operating with regard to, advocating, litigating, creating policy around LGBTQ folks, but more specifically around trans folks. And then thinking about how a lot of these things have been done in a way that, you know, really look at these different points of identity as discrete categories, and not as like, you know, just points of identity that are always constantly in conversation and intersecting, and unfortunately, like, you know, stemming out of each other. So again, really grateful to have this time to talk about this stuff, and really looking forward to, you know, thinking about it in a way that like truly tries to connect the dots, so that way we can really engage in some really intentional and truly transformative work.
Yeah, I think that I'm so grateful to be in conversation with you as always. So I think where I wanted to start was a concept that I have been sort of working with and thinking about a lot in some of the thinking I've been trying to do about how transgender privacy cases are treated by courts. And so, you know, I want to start by like framing sort of a background idea, which is like cis normativity, right? So, you know, if Tara's like, yeah, obviously I know what cis normativity is. Most of our listeners probably do it as well, but it's basically this sort of assumption that society assumes cisness. This cisness is the default, right? Cisgender people are treated as the default, and there's sort of this need to get sort of special dispensation to take care of trans folks. So every time we think about like a trans person having to go before a court to sort of change a gender marker on a piece of identification, or you know, special or certain types of medical care be requiring more sort of evidence than they might for trans people than they might for cis people, or even things like the places where there's an assumption that like all women have vulvas or vaginas, right? All of that is sort of an example. Those can be examples of cis normativity. And I think it's really useful to start there because I personally have sort of moved towards contrasting it with this term that Austin Johnson coined called transnormativity. And Johnson uses this term to talk about the ways in which, you know, there's sort of a hierarchy of like who's considered in terms of trans folks. So the phrase he uses is that transnormativity describes how presentation and experiences of gender are held accountable, and how the lens of the binary medical model structures transgender experiences. You know, I think that like you can talk, the term transnormativity is relatively new, but like certainly there's tons of historical examples. You know, Susan Stryker in her book talks transgender history, talks about like back in the 1960s when women, and I think this is also in The Empire Strikes Back. I totally just blanked up. Sandy Stone's book essay talked about how basically like trans women and trans feminine folks would pass around this sort of list of criteria that doctors use, so that when they went before a doctor to get access to like hormones or surgery, they could like present transness in the right way in order to like get access, right? And I think that Johnson's point that he makes in the article is that sort of, or my take on it is that transnormativity suggests that transgender people who only challenge the assumption that gender is consistent with sex assigned at birth are prioritized over those that challenge the idea that sex is like a meaningful biological based category, the gender is binary, or the gender can change over time, right? So when we talk about like this kind of like talking about medical stuff around like persistence, consistent, and insistence, the consistent, insistent, and persistent, I'm not going to try to make them nouns. I'll keep them in adjective form, right? Like a lot of that has to do with the way in which transnormativity is operating, like a certain set of assumptions. And I think for me, as I started like digging into this, the more that I looked at it, the more that I could see that animating a huge amount of like lawyering around and theoretically for trans folks. Like, and I'm wondering, like, in the interest of me not going on and on and on, about this academic theoretical construct, Avatara, if you want to jump in and talk a little bit about either the way that you've seen that, or how, if you want to jump to how that relates to sort of the ways in which trans identities are racialized, I'd be happy to hear about either.
Yeah, no, so I think I'm gonna like slowly shift to thinking about how gender is racialized, because I think that that's always my entry point. And so, you know, I will say, and I think that this is like the best way to kind of like root myself in this conversation is, you know, I approach this work purely through like experiences that I have that are personal to me, but also experiences of people that I'm deeply like in community with. And so, you know, in thinking about gender broadly, you know, the thing that I kept on coming back to was that there was this amazing piece that I read years ago when I was like on my own little path towards like figuring out me, that like really just like revolutionized the way that I was like understanding gender as like a Black person in the US. And so, you know, Hari Zaid had a piece in Afropunk called My Gender is Black. And I'm gonna just read like a simple quote, but you know, essentially Hani goes on to say, I'm only now realizing that this is because Blackness ruptures the laws of gender, just like the laws of the state seem intent on rupturing Black life. And I like held that quote for such a long time because it really like helped me understand and kind of put into kind of like some kind of framework to understand what does it look like to be trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and to also hold other identities, especially identities where we're talking about race. And a lot of that looks like, you know, thinking about the history of gender in this country as, you know, being against the backdrop of like racialized violence. And that's like not a new concept at all, right? That's looking at like the work of Horton Spillers, that's looking at the work of C. Riley Snorton, that's looking at the work of so many amazing Black thought leaders, or, you know, Black producers of like amazing thought. And so I think that that's important because I think that, and you know, we'll get more into this as we go along, but I think that so often what happens is that when gender is not seen as being racialized, it allows for a lot of this work that we do in LGBTQ spaces, and then specifically around trans folks, to kind of be flattened. Because it's then assumed that, especially when we're talking about so many important pieces that people need in order to just like access different parts of just day-to-day life, there's something that gets removed, right? So for example, when we're talking about like identity documents, and this is like a conversation that we sometimes come to, when we're talking about identity documents, so often when we're thinking about that type of litigation, a lot of it is framed around like, you need identity documents, and truthfully, because it's like, you know, part of safety, it's part of being able to access so many opportunities, so many things. And then it's just, I mean, we live in a police state, so some things have to be shown, right? And then, you know, when I would look closer at like the conversations around identity documents and thinking about privacy and safety, I would often come back to privacy and safety for who, right? Because in many ways, when we think about the conversation piece for safety and identity documents, so often the story that gets told is like, for example, if you're interacting with a police officer and you show them your identity document, you're going to want to make sure that they can, you know, be accurate when they're, you know, talking to you, and, you know, not, you know, it helps with, you know, possibly making that interaction a little bit lighter. And I would kind of pause sometimes and be like, for who, right? Because I think at that moment we have to recognize that something has happened where there's actually a disconnect, right? Where you're no longer thinking about all the ways in which, like, you know, trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming people show up, right? So we're not only talking about like just the person in terms of their gender, but we're also talking about the person in terms of being Black, brown, you know, possibly undocumented, you know, being disabled, like all these other things. And so your interaction is actually changing, right? You move from this like quote unquote singular point of being, and, you know, this is just the honest to God truth of being, you know, maybe a white trans person interacting with an arm of the state, to a person who's holding multiple identities. So again, placing myself in this position, if I get stopped by someone who is a police officer, there are multiple things being read onto me at that moment, right? And an identity document can point to a few, but it's not going to address all the other ways in which this person is now going to be in conversation with me. And so when we come to these things, when we're discussing like safety, when we're talking about privacy, we're not really actually getting into the nitty gritty of what that looks like for different folks. And because we have typically moved from, and I'm always willing to be challenged on this point, but since we have typically moved from a space where whether known or unknowingly, we've done this, where, you know, it's like, here's this trans person interacting with this person, and this is how the interaction can go. We're kind of doing ourselves a disservice, right? Because that's not always how the interaction is going to go, because of the fact that when we're also talking about Black trans people, when we're talking about brown trans, like, it's going to look different. And so, you know, I'm gonna like pause there briefly, because again, it's just like, if we were to operate from this understanding of gender being racialized, if we were to actually talk about the fact that, you know, for many folks who are Black and brown, gender is going to be read differently, is going to be associated with different things, right? So me now being like a Black person who sometimes gets red masked in certain interactions means that there's a heightened chance that like violence is going to happen, right? But it's going to look different based on like where I am on that weird space of gender. And a lot of that is not going to be able to be negotiated through like, here's how you should interact with the police. With this identity document that now has, you know, maybe an accurate marker for where you are in terms of gender. And then again, you know, we don't have to touch upon this, but, you know, oftentimes I've like talked to Black trans folks, but specifically my Black non-binary friends. And a lot of the conversation comes back to, and then what does it look like to also have markers that are not easily recognizable? Like we understand that as we're moving out of this binary of M and F into possibilities of X and so on, therefore, like where does that also put you in interactions with the state? And so, you know, I think that as we're like moving towards, you know, hopefully some level of progress, because I think that that's really the only accurate identifier for what we're doing. We really have to be more intentional, and we really have to start thinking about like, who is this hypothetical person that we're speaking of when we're talking about these things.
I think just to pick up on that, I think one thing that we've sort of talked about a little bit is that like a lot of material produced for trans folks often assumes that the only reason the state would have a problem with you is that you're trans, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you know, which is assuming whiteness. And is assuming citizenship status, is assuming a variety of things, but I think whiteness is sort of the central assumption there, right? And that, you know, as movement, as like LGBT organizations are seeking to kind of fix the state has a problem with you because you're trans, they're only going to fix that for white folks if they're sort of starting from the assumption that transness is the sole thing that would make an encounter with the police go badly.
Exactly.
And then I think I wanted to just sort of tie this to the transnormativity, because otherwise it can seem like I'm way far off in theoretical land, which does happen. So, you know, but I think actually like what is, I think really, Avatara, what I think is really amazing, both about your points and about the Saeed piece, which I cannot like second enough, it's so good, I put it in chat, is that, you know, and actually Johnson talks about this in his original paper. So the way he comes up with this concept called transnormativity is he looks at a whole bunch of documentary films and like articulates what he sees. And they're primarily, I think they're all, the films he looked at were all trans mask folks, because he's trans mask. And so that was the angle he used. But what he actually noticed after he did his first initial pass was they were all about white trans folks, and he went back and added, right, additional films, right, to look at sort of Black and brown trans experiences. I think it's specifically Black trans men's experience. But I think it's actually worth noting, not as a call out to Johnson for not doing it correctly, but I think he, like, what that story about how transnormativity is framed actually like really does hit the same point, which is that like, if we think being trans looks like what transnormativity looks like, if we think transnormativity is, as Johnson says, right, a way of disciplining what it means to be trans, then the fact that it centers whiteness means that like if we follow that in our legal stuff, we're also going to end up centering whiteness, even if we're not even articulating a specific racial, oftentimes, especially if we're not articulating any specific like racial analysis. And I think that like that has been, it's really, I think one example that is like worth bringing up, and I think Avatara, you already flagged this a little bit, but just to drill down on it, right, is like identity documents. We talk about them ad nauseum, right? So historically, for a long time, there were surgical requirements for certain types of switches to identity documents. So if you wanted to change your birth certificate, for example, you had to get surgery. And there's a variety of reasons that's terrible. Like, you know, as many folks have pointed out, right, that is in self-transnormative. Lots of trans folks don't want to get surgery. But think that one of the other things that it was doing was effectively functioning as a racial barrier, right, to certain types of, to access to changes on gender documents, because of, for a long time, surgery was not actually covered by healthcare, which meant you had to pay out of pocket, which meant that like the sheer amount of money you had often had way more to do with whether you were able to get surgery than anything else. And then like by then you've imported whiteness, right? So I think that like it's worth noting the ways in which like it doesn't seem like, oh, like a surgery requirement for an identity document would sort of have a racial component, but at the same time it definitely like had outcomes that were racialized in terms of who sort of got access to those kinds of identity document changes. I can see like your thinking based on Avatara, so please.
No, yeah, because I mean, yes, and like also just drilling down, and I think so, you know, kind of like coming back to like a point that we were talking about a little bit earlier, is just like, so if you're litigating from a space, and just to make it easier, if you're, you know, and easier to use like lightly, but if you're litigating from a space where like the assumption around the person whose rights you're, you know, advocating for, like, you know, fighting for, where you're not acknowledging race, right? That automatically means that the person is likely white. Like, let's just be honest, like that's it, right? And so like, what does that mean and what gets lost? And I think that, so what happens often is that it's like this very flat, quote unquote, clean type of case, where you're not thinking about all the ways in which like these systems interact to, you know, disenfranchise and to marginalize certain individuals, right? So coming back to your point, it's just like, not only are we thinking again of like, okay, so who is more likely to be able to afford care out of pocket, right? And that's a class conversation, right? We're also thinking about like, who's more likely to have the funds to be able to do this type of thing when every single, you know, and again, as insurance companies change and this and the third, like, but at the time when that wasn't something that was often covered, who are we talking about? So while we're talking about someone who has resources, like that type of like financial capability to do that either on their own or in community with folks, right? We're also like starting to think about like, okay, how has the medical industrial complex also limited access to this type of care? So you also have to start thinking about like, you know, for example, there are so many folks who I know who are in the process of getting chest surgery who literally, I'll see like group chats on Facebook where they're just like, my doctor said that they won't do this type of care because my BMI is this, and because of that, that means that, you know, this, that, and third. And it's just like, that's okay. So, you know, again, it's been interesting because all of this is not happening in the conversation around identity documents, especially at the time when we were talking about identity documents that had surgical requirements. Like, this was not like, you know, all the thinking that was going in, because that complicates things, right? And then all of a sudden that makes it a little bit too messy and not as neat and clean as it can be in order to, like, you know, move the ball forward. And I think that, and I mean, this is this is not a singular problem that only happens in like litigation around LGBTQ rights. Like, that can be seen in almost every type of work that people do, whether it's, you know, just like, you know, talking about like, you know, abortion care or race discrimination or this, that, and the third. Like, it happens in a lot of spaces. But again, like, you know, since this is a conversation, I guess like my emphasis is like, and how are we making these decisions, right? Because so often I think if we were really to, and I always come back to this, if we were really to start from a point of thinking, all right, who's the most marginalized in this community when we're talking about a lack of access? And how do we actually move from that point forward? Because I think, and like, again, willing to be pushed on this, that so often the way that we actually do this work is trickle down. It's always from this, and again, whether we are acknowledging it and doing it on purpose, or whether it's just happening because of like just who so happens to land in front of us when we're thinking about, you know, litigation or policy work or this, that, and third, it becomes a trickle down of like, ding, 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 like you can have it, but you're gonna have to fall into these certain categories. And so, yeah, I just keep coming back.
I think that trickle down point is so key, because I think that like, you know, in some ways, like I always go back to like ENDA, right? The debates over, you know, what was the Equality Act, right? Like, you know, the federal anti-discrimination bill that sort of was trying to ban discrimination against I was going to say LGB, but let's just go with LG, right? right? So bisexual people not at the forefront of what was going on with ENDA, but right, there was this active debate about whether HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, should continue to sort of push for the bill when trans folks weren't going to be included. And the sort of logic of continuing to push for it was, well, we'll come back to you later, right? And I think this, Avatara, this gets to the point you were making about clean cases, right? As lawyers, oftentimes it's like, oh, well, I want something that's like nice and clean and we don't have to fight about a bunch of stuff. But like the reality is like, the people whose lives are nice and clean are not the people in the most need of services usually,
Exactly.
right? Like they're not the folks at the margins, and they're not the folks experiencing sort of multiple intersecting forms of oppression. And I think that like in the urge to kind of like make specific strategic gains, there is this way in which it can kind of sort of assume that like you'll catch up at some point, or like some point will get to you. And I think in some ways, like, when I read Bostock, for example, the Supreme Court case from last term, I can both understand entirely why the ACLU made the specific decisions they did with regards to arguing like a particular textual meaning to the word sex within the context of Title VII, the anti-employment discrimination statute. And also, it's hard for me as a non-binary person because I can really see the way in which that these particular sort of deployments of the phrase sex, right? A textual reading of the statute could potentially permit discrimination against non-binary folks. Now, I would, of course, argue in court that that shouldn't be allowed. And like, I don't plan on sort of coming in and being like, here, my textualist argument. But like, the sort of trickle down litigation strategy of centering a white trans woman as opposed to sort of someone who is sort of non-binary or sort of Black or brown, right? Who might have had a more complicated case, does mean that we sort of get these decisions where you're like, well, is that going to trickle down to me, right? Exactly. As a non-binary person, as a Black non-binary person, etc.
I mean, I think about Bostock, and I think about the fact that, I've been thinking about race discrimination in general and how that's been watered down. And then you think about sex discrimination and how that's been watered down, using watered down very lightly and not, going into the deep context of what I mean by that. But in terms of saying like, it becomes harder and harder sometimes for people to just prove what they need to prove in order to say like, this is like race-based discrimination, right? And then thinking about all the ways that intersects when you're talking about people who hold multiple identities. And again, I hear where you're coming from and I see what you're saying. And I think that, this begs the question is just like, so what does the path forward look like, right? And like, what does it mean when these questions come up and like these like righteous critiques are like, brought up? And it's not because, I think so often people are just like, oh, we're just like having these discussions because we're like nitpicking. And I'm like, actually, I think that what we're doing right now and what like a lot of folks are doing are saying like, for so long, there have been groups of people who are like the, miners canary, where they're just like alerting y'all to the fact that like, if we actually don't move in a way that is super strategic and like really intentional, and yes, it's not always going to be nice, neat, and quote unquote clean, we're going to lose progress, right? And if we don't do it almost in sync with all the other things that we see happening, right? Because, for example, and how we've been briefly talking about it is just like, I look at like the pathway of like how abortion care has kind of been whittled down. And I easily see like what it now looks like to criminalize healthcare for trans folks, right? Because those things then become like super connected. You're like, oh, wait, like this looks really familiar, same playbook, right? And so, again, I just kind of come back to this point of saying like, how do we again move from a point where we're really being intentional and strategic and thinking about the way that like there are going to be folks who are more impacted than others, right? And what would it look like if we were to kind of take on those cases that sometimes feel like they're a little bit quote unquote messy, but no, they're actually not messy. I think that they actually lead to cleaner results because you're actually getting at the heart of what's happening, right? Which is like, yes, gender, yes, race, yes, all these things layered on top of that. But like, we have to have this conversation at the same time, and we can't have it in like these little clean, neat, discrete silos.
Yeah, you can't, like, you don't get to come back to the race conversation, right? Like, oh, like we'll do it for the white trans folks, and then like afterwards we'll figure it out. It's not gonna work, right? And I mean, I think that it's funny because like with the ENDA example, right, trans folks understood that with regards to ENDA, right? Like that was why people were upset about HRC's decision. They were like, well, if you pass this law, you know, for banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, and you don't include gender identity, if you don't include trans folks, like you're not going to come back to it, right? Like,
Yeah.
and that was sort of the argument at the time. And I think the same critique very much still applies to sort of white focused, white trans person focused, or just white focused sort of LGBT movement work, which is like, you know, you're not going to come back to it, right? Like, you know, I think that in some ways we can see the post-marriage like sort of moment in LGBT movement work to kind of, and the sort of, I think, I don't want to be too cruel to my colleagues, like a crisis of focus, right? Especially because of the way in which organizations were not prepared to knew that the pivot was towards focusing on trans rights, but did not often have the expertise, the skills, or the pipeline to do so, right?
Yeah.
Let alone like Black and brown trans rights,
Exactly.
or, you know, Black and brown sex workers who are also trans women, right? And like, I think that it's a really difficult dynamic because I think that it often requires lawyers sort of set aside their own personal preferences and like their own goals for cases and put those behind those of their clients, right? And that I think is one difficult dynamic of the way impact litigation has sort of functioned to run the space to be like one of the primary ways the space works for a while. You know, and I think that's been true in, you know, trans rights in particular. But yeah, anyway, that is, I mean, we're agreeing with each other.
I mean, like, I'm completely right there with you. And I think I just keep on coming back to, you know, I want to make it abundantly clear, like, yes, there have been cases brought on behalf of like Black and brown trans folks, right? Like, that's not what's being said. I think that what's really like, the point that I keep on coming back to is that, and even when we look at the body of work that has come out, and it's not even specific to always like thinking about litigation or policy, but even in the ways that we actually just talk about these issues generally, right? So like, for example, if we were just slightly pivot to like, you know, TSA and interactions in those ways, right? Even if we were to look at how we've discussed identity documents in that space, right? There have been times when like we've read, you know, like what are the best ways to like navigate interactions with TSA when you're trans, right? And so often it's just like, you know, show your identity document, like, you know, be calm, like just think about the interaction, like you'll be on your way. And I was like, again, it comes back to like, for who, right? Because like, who is the baseline person that you're talking about when you're talking about interaction at a site like an airport where we're talking about interacting with TSA, right? And so often that looks like there are going to be people who are subjected to like heightened scrutiny as they're walking through that space, right? Because of the fact that they are Black and brown, because of maybe like, you know, disability, because of other perceptions that like people have, or that the identities that people are reading onto them. And so, you know, when I've seen even like conversations with, you know, national organizations around identity documents in that space, again, there's like this disservice that we're doing, right? Because in many ways, we're not acknowledging the many ways that violence can show up, right? Because we're, again, coming back to this idea of like, the only reason why you could possibly be facing discrimination in that space is because you're trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary, right? It's just like, well, is that actually the only reason, right? Is that the only reason why you might be pulled aside? When we know that there's a history and a body of work that talks about specifically Black, oftentimes, you know, it's come to Black cis women and like the policing around here. When we know what it looked like post 9/11 for brown folks to interact with TSA. And so again, let's like think about it. Like, what are the many reasons why someone who is transgender, who is also holding multiple identities, why they might be encountering levels of violence or like, you know, discrimination? And it's not only because they're trans, it's because they hold so many other identities, right? And so even in putting out information about how to best survive those interactions if you don't come back to the point of recognizing that gender is racialized, if you don't come back to the point of recognizing the ways that class, disability, immigration status, how all these things are layered onto that, you've done a disservice, right? You've already like made it clear who you're prioritizing in that moment, whether or not you mean to prioritize that group, but you've made it clear because you've told me now that like you're only experiencing discrimination because you're trans. And I'm like, am I? Is that really the only reason? So again.
Yeah, I mean, we've literally talked, and I'll sort of like pause and slash end on this note, but like, you know, we've literally talked about our TSA experiences, right? And how like, you know, I'm trans, my body does not match in particular either the blue button or the pink button for the TSA, but like, unless I'm accidentally carrying an X-Acto knife through security, which just happened, I generally don't have a problem with the TSA because, you know, whiteness, right? I think the other thing I wanted to flag on the, you know, like the history of like the TSA as like a really interesting example of how these dynamics manifest is actually like post 9/11 when Congress was passing the Real ID Act, which is the current thing that is like causing all kinds of problems for attempts to eliminate gender markers from state driver's licenses. There were trans orgs that opposed the Real ID Act. The Sylvia Rivera Law Project, I believe, opposed the Real ID Act, right? Because it may not have been SLRP. There were trans orgs and trans organizers who were opposing the Real ID Act, but they weren't opposing it based on the gender requirement on the documentation, although they could have. They were opposing it because they knew that it was part of a surveillance apparatus that was going to harm Muslims in the United States and brown folks more generally, right? And then be also used against Black folks, other folks who are criminalized in whatever way, right? So like, it is sort of funny because I do think there are these ways in which the, like, to the point about like, when does it actually trickle down, right? Like, you know, in some ways it's reversed, right? The logic of the impact litigation is, oh, we get this nice clean case, we just get it decided, it'll trickle down to people whose cases are more messy. But the reality is, Avatara, exactly as you said, right? If you can do it on the sort of messier things, on the bigger stuff, on the stuff where actually you're sort of going to bat on things that don't seem quite like your issue, you can often make the kinds of impacts that will be more sustainable in the long term to fighting for that change. Not just because you may actually get the change that you want, but also because you're in coalition, right? And like people, you know, that you're acknowledging the interdependence of the folks like of these identities, of folks in these movements, right? Rather than sort of trying to section off like your bit as if it were different.
Yeah, exactly.
On that note, unless Avatara, any last thoughts before we go to taking questions?
No, we can go to taking questions.
Yeah. So I'm seeing sort of a question about, let's see, pre-puberty youth, the Indiana High School Athletic Association. So, I mean, I think that, you know, one thing I want to flag is neither I or Avatara live in Indiana, and I do not consider myself an expert on sort of local Indiana sports law or sort of what the most effective mobilization strategy might be. So maybe I'll use this really like sort of detailed specific question as a prompt more generally to talk about kind of the issue of sports. Right, and the sort of some of the current questions around sort of sex segregation and sports. How does that sound to you, Avatara?
Go on. I have some thoughts, but you go first.
So I mean, I think it's complicated, right? I think, you know, some of my work actually kind of deals with the ways in which the conversation around sex is actually just as complicated as the conversation around gender. And I think that my urging to folks who are considering kind of the questions of like high school sports is that ultimately it feels more important to me to focus on this like sort of social impact of being on a sports team, rather than thinking about like, oh, who's competing and like how, you know, if you went through male puberty, does this give you a slight advantage in some sports outcome? Because I think that that's just frankly a straw man most of the time. Like there's very little evidence that, you know, trans girls who even if they like are midway through a medical transition or like are on puberty blockers or whatever, right? Like there's very little evidence that they're gonna like systemically harm cis girls who are participating in sports. I kind of think the whole thing is, I don't know. I'm going to stop there. Avatara, I'm curious as to your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole sports situation is like, of course, like in many ways, you know, the last of many failed attempts by like conservatives, right-wing folks to like latch onto something that they see as being like, you know, a battle they can win. So that's just broadly it. The thing that I keep on thinking about when I think about sports, though, is that, you know, and talking about like how to best be in coalition with people who are also impacted is just the way that we talk about sports in general, right? Like if you look at the history of testing in sports, specific broadly, right? But then if you go into like drug testing or even sex testing in sports, look at who's actually been disproportionately impacted for the long run, and that has actually been usually Black cis women, because of, you know, just thoughts on like who's winning and why they're winning and this, that, and the third, right? And so when I think about, you know, these conversations coming up, I you know, I also want to beg folks to go a little bit deeper, not because I want you to take your eye off the ball of like who in this moment is being impacted, but thinking about the history of like what has been happening in terms of who has been, you know, subject to like, you know, invasive like surveillance practices around like, you know, the body and sex and like, you know, all these different things. So like that's like one of my biggest points that I always come back to, because I think when you do that, one, you kind of are able to show like how this is not something that's brand new, it's just being done in a different way. Also, who will likely be impacted by it, who maybe is not thinking about this kind of stuff. And then again, it comes back to, you know, to the point that you were making, Kendra, is just like, yeah, and then just think about like the actual impact in terms of like, you know, community building, right? Like when you're talking about literally erasing a group of people from, you know, public participation in something as big but simple as sports, you're talking about erasure. You're talking about like this attempt to remove people. And like I think that, you know, if we were to really get into that, that would really show like how kind of like, just for lack of better wording, how disgusting these tactics are, right? Because broadly, everything that I've seen in terms of like attacks on trans folks, but specifically attacks on trans youth, have been, you know, this push and push and push to erase and to deny access and to deny care. So I think that that's where I would like fall off.
I think the other thing I would say is, you know, this is not to diminish the importance of like belonging and the way in which eliminating or making it harder for trans kids to participate in sports is about erasure.
Mm-hmm.
But I also like wonder about the way in which this is also an implicit like conversation about whiteness, right? Like that, you know, like a lot of the sort of energy around trans kids participating in sports assumes a particular relationship to certain kinds of like high school sports cultures that like may or may not actually relate to how most trans like kids even want to engage, right? And I'm not, you know, like I don't know the demographics and the dynamics in the states that have been sort of considering these bills well enough to sort of tell you one way or the other how I think this relates to kind of sort of conversations about sort of like white suburban girlhood. But I think there's probably some ways in which certain kinds of motivation around sports participation is also sort of about like for whom and for what people in what kinds of areas like sports participation is seen as a priority. And like, I also, you know, just want to say in the sort of like vein that we're talking about, right? Like one other question I have is like, what other barriers are there to folks participating in sports that are like, you know, that aren't getting the same kinds of attention, right? Like I know that, you know, in my high school, for example, which was a public high school in Connecticut, right? You know, there were regularly pretty substantial costs to participate in extracurricular sports, especially the kinds that would maybe effectively get you a scholarship to college. And like, if we consider the sort of question sort of from a more intersectional perspective of like, you know, not just like, yes, like this individual, you know, white trans girl can't participate in sports, but like, what are the dynamics involved in these participation? I wonder if we kind of come to different answers about what the advocacy strategy should look like, or about the ways in which we might broaden participation more generally, rather than sort of focusing solely on these kind of like sex or like, and competition questions. So I don't know, Avatara, this is a long answer to that question. So I'm happy to either keep talking about this or move on to one of the other ones.
No, I see that we have a couple more questions, so I want to make sure that we like have time for those. There's another one. I'll read this next one off. So how can law students incorporate these conversations in classes where professors say these intersectional discussions are outside of the syllabus? I will like quickly give like a very neat answer to this. Anytime someone says that some kind of discussion around, you know, broadly intersectionality, but what you're talking about is just like all the ways that identity can impact someone's ability to move through this world. Anytime someone says that that's outside of the syllabus, chances are it's not, and that's a lie. Even in those things that you think do not touch upon race, they likely do. If they don't, you know, so like, for example, like, let's see. So like one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is thinking about content creation and who owns, like when we're talking about like rights, right? Who owns the rights to certain things? And so like there have been conversations coming up around things like the use of TikTok and like Instagram, this, that, and third, where like, you know, I see people talking about it and they broadly talk about it in the sense of like, you know, just like, this is not my area of law, so I'm not going to dive into it, but they'll just broadly talk about it in the typical way that you talk about like, you know, the rights of like those who create content and things like that. And again, it seems very like straightforward and very like flat, right? But then what I think about is like, well, actually, who is this mostly impacting right now? Like if you're thinking about the people who are talking about being literally removed from their content and not having the ability to generate profit off of it, or they're seeing in real time how specific creators are getting prioritized and platformed, and they are instead getting deplatformed and not prioritized. That often looks like Black and brown LGBTQ people who are creating amazing content, but you know, due to the ways that this technology is working, it allows for this removal of like who is the originator of this content. So you know, this might seem like a little far-fetched, but like to bring it back, it's actually like we don't live single issue lives, and I hate to say it this way, but that's really just the case. And so when you're in classes or if you're in, you know, clinics where like, you know, it's presented like these things don't actually have any connection, oftentimes I think that means that the work that's being done is actually not good. And that means that there are going to be things that get left behind or not looked at, or you're not actually even looking at a history of how things have come to be in this country around certain things. So I hope that makes sense and is helpful.
Yeah, I just want to second what Avatara said. So Anjali Bhatts at BU has a bunch of really amazing work on race and copyright, if you're interested in that issue. Always with them we're reading. So just to be like a very brief answer to the kind of like law students incorporating this conversations into class, I think the other thing to say is that, you know, I'm going to suggest more reading because that's the kind of person I am. But like, if your professors aren't actually talking about race in your classes or talking about, you know, the ways in which race and gender intersect in your classes, like, you know, one thing that folks did when I was in law school was they formed like basically a separate reading group where that's what they talked about, right? And like, you know, do I want to say like, great, you should do more work to like actually get like, no, that's horrible. You should have professors who are actually willing to not just center whiteness, right? Which is what happens if you don't discuss race. You know, there are materials that like can help you learn about these backgrounds, even if your professors aren't bringing them up directly. And I think that's worth flagging. Do we want to take I'll take the next question.
Yeah.
Someone asks, talking about messy cases where multiple points of intersectionality add complexity of facts, how can we convince supervising attorneys or law school clinic directors to take these cases over the easy cases? This is a great question. I'm really glad you asked. As a clinician, right, I think there's a couple different potential techniques. One is to say that, these cases, messy cases, are going to be better learning opportunities. And that's kind of a self-interested way to frame it. And I kind of like don't like that from a like large scale movement building perspective. But I think that like if you're trying to appeal to a clinician, being like, hey, like actually I think I'd learned a lot working on this case, I think there's a lot here that's sort of novel or interesting. But I also think that like, the conversation, especially within the context of clinics, is often, we often don't talk enough about who we're doing the work for, right? Clinics often, have their own priorities in terms of how they take cases or how they think about sort of matters. And I think that, thinking about whether it's possible to explicitly change the ways in which you prioritize the cases you take so that you can like think about taking cases where folks are, where you're prioritizing folks at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities for services. Or, think about whether there's more other intake strategies you could be using that you aren't currently using to find folks who are experiencing certain forms of harm that like aren't getting brought up to you. But yeah, Avatara, I'll let you share.
I mean, I think the only thing I would add to that is like, so again, just being clear that like the use of the term messy is not to like talk about the lives of those individuals or, the situation, but to just think like broadly of how like people think that certain things complicate things. So like just coming back to that point really quickly. But the other part that I want to get to is that, taking on the quote unquote cases that are messy is a strategy, right? Because you don't do it just because like, oh, there's a possibility that this can lead to that, right? You also have to look at like, so what are you specifically doing? Like, what are you like advocating for? And like making sure also that, people aren't harmed in the act of trying to do that. So like sometimes actually you don't take on the messy case, right? And, I've had like that happen in some ways because I was just like, actually, we can't do this. And in conversation with, the potential client, because of the fact that like moving in such a way might actually lead to more harm. And like, although that sucks in the moment because you're just like, well, dang, like when do you actually get to like have this, potential plaintiff to move this ball forward in this way, it's also a recognition that just because it's something that, broadly, you're just like, yeah, this would be the right thing to do. You also recognize that you also don't want to like cause more harm for a community, right? So, I think that that's like the only thing I add on to it because I don't want to also make it seem like the messy cases are the winning cases. So often they're actually not. Those are the cases that people don't win, but at least you're kind of like chipping away at something or you're acknowledging something, or at least you're like bringing attention to something. And sometimes it's also not just the case. Like sometimes it's, talking about policies, talking about like community education, or, and then again, thinking about like, and those are also ways to kind of move the ball forward as well, because so often people want to think that's like litigation and this, like, no, that's not always the answer. I hope to God not, that's not always the answer.
Yeah, I think the thing I'll just add to that, which I totally agree with, is like you kind of want a level of cultural competency in addition to the sort of client, like what Avatara is suggesting, which is like sometimes actually it's client-centered not to take a particular case, right? Sorry, what I mean by that is, hey, like litigation is not the outcome that will be most likely to be successful for that client for their goals. But I also think that it's important to think about like the ways in which oftentimes like, we may not actually have the infrastructure or the cultural competence or the skills to handle cases that are complex, right? If for example, you have a clinic with primarily white supervisors well, let's even make it sort of more straightforward than that, right? Like white, straight supervisors, it may be actually really difficult for folks to get the cultural competency necessary to have enough rapport and conversation with someone to treat a Black non-binary person or a Black gender non-conforming person to really be able to advocate on their behalf with regards to their own experience of gender, right? And like that is hard because I don't want to suggest like don't do it, like just ignore it, right? Like but I do think that there is a way in which the slogans that sometimes we end up repeating around gender, you know, trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary people are non-binary, while, you know, true as a starting point, like as a slogan, are not sometimes, as like Hari Zaid's piece says, and as Avatara already said, don't encompass the complexity of people's gender experiences. And because of that, we have to be careful about how we deploy them in litigation when we know that they will be used against the very people who are already more marginalized. I think we're at time. So Avatara, any last thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, one, just in general, like, you know, really appreciating the space to have this conversation, really hoping that, like, you know, in many ways this can continue on. And, you know, hoping that, you know, to see community come together to really think broadly and strategically about, you know, what it looks like to move forward. But also, again, like, I do think that we are really at, and I know this is gonna sound like, are we always, but like, I really do think we're at a critical juncture right now to really be intentional and strategic about what the path forward is gonna look like. And I really feel like if we don't really start thinking about like the ways that we've been operating to dismiss how other identities can impact the way that folks access and move in space, it's going to bite us in the behind, like, to just make it so easy, especially as we're thinking about, you know, rights in digital spaces and what's that going to look like as well in terms of like our interactions with technology and technology's interactions with ourselves. So yeah, this was a great conversation. It's always cool talking to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much to the LGBT Project for hosting us. Really appreciate the space and time to think about these things. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.